Jen Ketterly and Kim Stein will dive into the critical role that hydration and nutrition play in rehabilitating athletes after injury and walk through some case studies that you can apply to your athletes. So Jen is a registered dietitian and a board-certified specialist in the sports dietetics with over 18 years of experience. Jen was the founding director of the sports nutrition departments at the Universities of Georgia and North Carolina at Chapel Hill and began her career at the University of Connecticut. Dr. Kim Stein is a senior principal scientist at the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, where she oversees programming and the translation of science information for influencers as well as athlete and team testing. So please welcome Kim and Jen.
All right, thank you. There are still a few seats up in the front. Any brave souls? All right, good afternoon. I think it's afternoon now. Hope your conference is off to a good start. Thank you for coming. This is a passion area of mine. I live with an athletic trainer. I work with a lot of athletic trainers. I love to work with Jen because I know this is a passion area of hers too. I think that nutrition is an untapped area of recovery. There's not a lot of good research in it. It's a hard thing to research, right? You know, you either do an intervention, then you wait for people to get injured if you're looking at prevention, or you have to wait for somebody to get injured, and then you don't really want to mess with them with research, right, to see them get to recover. So we have to extrapolate from a lot of, bed rest studies, older adults, things like that. But I think there's a good chunk of literature here that we can apply to our athletes to help them, as they're going through this recovery process, potentially return to play a little bit faster. And we're talking about just nutrition today. We're not talking about the psychological aspects and all the things that you do. But to me, nutrition is one extra modality in your toolbox in getting your athletes back to the court or field or pool or mountain or whatever it is faster. So Jen and I are going to tag team this today. I'm the scientist, so I'm going to tell you what we know from the literature. Jen's going to provide the real world commentary on how she applies this with athletes that she worked with. So I'm going to talk about muscle tissue, and I'm going to talk about muscle tissue the most because I think that's where we can have the biggest impact. Talk a little bit about connective tissue and bone. We'll talk about inflammation and pain, and then wrap up with the energy needs of the athlete during the recovery phase. So we'll start with muscle and specifically immobilization. Now I know that not every injury leads or has an immobilization phase, but it's a point in time where we can have a big impact with the athlete because healthy inactive muscle, you take your healthy athlete, you put a cast on them, they can start to lose muscle mass pretty quickly, right about 0.5% per day, which is pretty quick, right? So depending on how long they're immobilized, they can lose a significant amount of muscle. And kind of as a side note, we can't do much nutritionally about this, but strength is going to decrease even faster than muscle size. Now, if we want to try and stem atrophy, we're never going to get rid of it, right? And you might do some muscle stim stuff to try and promote muscle protein synthesis, but we might be able to do some things nutritionally because metabolically what's happening is there's a decrease in muscle protein synthesis during this time. You're not getting the mechanical stimulus of exercise, so new muscles are not going to be created at the same rate. This is leading, the muscle is then in this anabolic resistant state. You might be eating the same amount of protein, which is our anabolic macronutrient, right? But the muscle is not as accepting of it. It's resistant to the protein when it is immobilized and not getting the mechanical input to it. And then if you add on top of that, the muscle is immobilized, it's not getting mechanical input, and if the athlete starts to decrease calorie intake because they're worried about gaining weight, which we'll talk about at the end, that further accelerates muscle loss. And so we really want to pay attention during this immobilization phase to what we can do to try and stem that atrophy. And there's a few things nutritionally that we can do. One is make sure your athlete is eating enough protein. So this 1.6 to 2.5 grams per kilogram a day is at the upper end of the range. A strength training athlete might be kind of in the upper end of that range. This probably goes beyond that. Now, most athletes, if they're not cutting back calories, and I shouldn't say most, many male athletes, are probably eating enough protein already if they don't cut back. But it's not just about total protein intake. What's more important than the total amount of protein is the pattern you're taking it in. So you want to hit the muscle repeatedly through the day with this anabolic macronutrient. About 20 to 40 grams. We don't really know the kind of the sweet spot. You can figure out about 0.25 to 0.3 grams per kilogram of body weight if you want to dial that in a little bit closer. But the important thing is the pattern, so that you're continually giving that stimulus to the muscle throughout the day. Want rich, good, complete sources of protein, but particularly one that is rich in the amino acid leucine. Leucine's interesting because not only is it a amino acid building block to new protein, but it acts as a trigger switch. It's a signaling molecule that tells when there's enough of it in your blood, says, hey, muscle, start assembling the new walls, start making new protein. And then don't forget about sleeping. So if you heard Matt speak in the presentation before us, he kind of dove into this research a little bit more. But if you have a pattern about 3 to 4 hours per day, that last feeding should be before sleep, when the athlete isn't taking in any more food, and you can create a more anabolic environment by having that pre-sleep protein. We think maybe casein is a good protein there because it's digested and absorbed more slowly. Research is building on that. It's not. I would not say that is definitive by any means, but it's good, a nice cup of cottage cheese, things like that. So this is the protein landscape of how you can help stem some of that anabolic resistance with immobilization. I want to throw it over to Jen now and talk about what do you do with athletes to meet that higher protein intake, specifically breaking it up into 20 to 40 gram amounts throughout the day. How do they get good leucine? Take it away.
Sure. Okay, so as Kim mentioned, that one of the most important concepts is this patterning. So food patterning and intake throughout the day. And so one of the things that we really want to avoid is skipping meals. Okay, and sometimes that's a hard sell to athletes, right? Breakfast, lunch, dinner, couple snacks in between. So a 3x2 pattern is really what we want to encourage. From there, as you see, the minimum of 20 grams is what we're shooting for. And ideally, at each of those time periods, we want to have equal divided doses. Okay, so 20 grams is really not that difficult to get in. Okay, if we think about a cup of Greek yogurt, it's typically about 14 grams of protein, right there. Okay, so you couple that with a piece of toast in the morning with some peanut butter on it, you're going to get to 20 very easily. Okay, an egg, for example, one egg is about 7 grams, so that is a super easy option as well for the morning. As we progress into the day, you can see how it would be pretty easy later in the day to eat sandwiches. A turkey sandwich, for example, typically going to be at minimum 15 grams, probably more up on the 20 to 25 grams, depending on how large it is, of protein, just in the turkey sandwich alone. So the 20, and then as you get on up to the 40, that would be for a larger athlete, larger individual, and so hopefully their intake and their appetite follows. So that 20 grams isn't super tough to reach. The other thing to think about would be nuts and nut butters. And so take peanut butter, for example. 2 tablespoons of peanut butter is going to give you 8 grams. And so that's not a whole lot. So couple that with a glass of milk, which is about 7 grams. You can, and one glass of milk, 8 ounces, isn't a whole lot. And so if you buy it off the shelf, you're going to get a greater volume. You can easily get milk and a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and be home free. Okay, a chicken breast, for example, going to be at least 20 to 25 grams. So if you're looking at your evening meal, not difficult to get in again. And so the idea really behind it is to emphasize that protein is a key nutrient during this time, as well as the patterning. The patterning really, for me, in my experience, has been the tougher sell. Is let's not skip meals. Let's make sure we're eating regularly throughout the day. So I found that I had to encourage that message more than I did on the volume, per se. Okay, and then as Kim mentioned, the leucine component, which is that trigger to that muscle protein synthesis, that is an amino acid that, of course, we can ingest with foods, and so we can find that in a lot of different places. One of our best sources is through whey protein. Okay, whey protein isolate has a probably the highest per volume of leucine content. Our meats follow, so our chicken, your steak are also going to have a good bit of leucine in the protein in the complete protein. From there, some other foods that are fairly high in leucine that you can encourage or incorporate or maybe pay a little bit of it more attention to during an injured time would be things like Swiss cheese. Swiss cheese has a pretty high amount of leucine in it. Edamame, pinto beans, things like that have a good bit of leucine in it. And so there's an exhaustive list, of course, that we can reference. But those are some key foods. The other component with the leucine really is dairy. The dairy category is a nice food group to incorporate and focus on during this time. As Kim mentioned, the casein. If you think about dairy proteins are typically 80-20, so 80% of the dairy protein is casein, and 20% of it is whey protein. And so if we see more on that topic, then the dairy foods may become more important for that nighttime feed.
Jen, do you think protein powders, bars, products like that are important during this time, or can they supplement the foods that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we often get a lot of questions about should I have a protein supplement? Do I just need a protein powder? And to that, I say if that works for you, then great. Protein supplements can absolutely do the trick. They can fit the bill for sure. They've got, as long as you look for the total amount. The whey protein isolate, as I mentioned, has the highest component of leucine. And then if you are looking for a soy type of protein, it's a little bit less. We think they work, but maybe not quite as effective as the whey protein. So if you're looking for a supplement, look for the minimum 20 gram total. The whey is better than soy. And then if you're in a environment where third-party testing is important, look for a product that has a third-party certification.
Okay, great, thanks. Moving on from protein, I'm going to list a couple of supplements here that we have a little bit of research behind that could be beneficial during immobilization. Now, I'm not going to talk about whether these are permissible, impermissible, all of those issues around supplements. Just from a scientific perspective, there's a little bit of research. HMB is a metabolite of leucine. There's a little bit of data to show that it might decrease muscle protein breakdown, increase synthesis. Mostly in older adults in bed rest is where this is seen, but there's a little bit of data starting to build around HMB during immobilization. Creatine is another one. If you have athletes that are using creatine, when they get injured is probably not the time to go off of it. Again, very little data here, but there is, a study shows that it's beneficial in maintaining muscle mass during immobilization, and one that shows that it's not. One was upper body. I think upper body was beneficial, lower body was not. 2 studies, impossible to extrapolate from there. Wouldn't necessarily start giving creatine if you didn't have a creatine user, but if you do have a user, consider keeping them using their supplement potentially during this time. And then fish oils. Fish oils have anabolic properties. They help sensitize the muscle to the protein, so to that anabolic environment. Now, fish oils are a little tricky because they're also very anti-inflammatory, and we're going to talk about in a little bit, some inflammation is good, and we don't necessarily want to be tapping that all the way down. So a fish oil supplement can be beneficial, maybe not right when the athlete is injured, unless they're maybe already taking one. But further along in their recovery, fish oils can, again, promote the anabolic environment of the muscle. Now, your athlete comes out of their cast, their brace, whatever it is. You're past the immobilization phase, or you never had an immobilization phase and you're going right into active rehab. I encourage you to treat your rehab like training in terms of recovery nutrition. What I mean by that is you do a workout session, you do a rehab session with your athletes, provide them the anabolic stimulus after that session, even if it's not hugely intense. Now, this is not a time you necessarily need the carbohydrate. You're not depleting muscle glycogen, so that piece of the recovery nutrition advice you wouldn't necessarily include. But the protein piece, to make sure this muscle is staying anabolic, getting the most benefit out of your rehab program, can be very beneficial. The advice doesn't change, about 20 grams, 0.25 to 0.3 grams per kilogram of body weight shortly after the session. Again, leucine rich. The story is not much different here, and then continuing the regular pattern throughout the day. Also, and this is probably true during immobilization too, but encourage your athletes to limit or ideally avoid alcohol during this time, because alcohol can impair muscle protein synthesis. So if they're going to have it, they might not be super happy because they're injured and they're not playing, might want to have a few drinks. At least encourage them to have it far away from their rehab session so they have plenty of time to promote protein synthesis during that time. So in here, we do have a study, and I'm going to show this to you. It's kind of old at this point. It's 2006. But there is one published study where they took 30 individuals that had an ACL injury, and they did a rehab session with them 3 times a week for 12 weeks, lower body strength training, 10 grams of protein. So this was before we had kind of the dose response information on protein and how much they should really have. So they had 10 grams. They compared that to equal calories of carbohydrate and a placebo. And what they found was the protein group had greater quadricep cross-sectional area and greater peak torque coming out of that 12-week ACL rehab program. So 30 individuals, it's not a huge study. It's the only one we have. But again, in this area where we don't have a lot of scientific evidence, it is one kind of piece of the puzzle where we can start applying, like, hey, let's treat rehab like a training session and make sure we're helping those muscles stay anabolic to get as much as we can out of it. Now, muscle, I think we drained. Let's move to another tissue where we actually have historically thought we cannot influence very much nutritionally. And that is the connective tissue and the ligaments. And it still holds true. There's not a lot we can do nutritionally because there's just so little blood flow into the connective tissue. But this guy here, Keith Barr, he's at UC Davis. He does these really cool experiments where he gets, when somebody does an ACL, has the ACL repair, he gets some of that, some of the tendon, and he grows these ligaments from those in these petri dishes, and he does all these really cool experiments on them. And then he's also now applied that work into humans in clinical trials and has a lot of case studies. And what he finds, if you have a combination of vitamin C and an amino acid profile, proline, lysine, hydroxyproline, hydroxylysine, that he can see increases in collagen synthesis, both in his fun little petri dishes with his ligaments and in humans. And the way he delivers that is really simple. He gives vitamin C, whether it's from orange juice or a vitamin C powder, and 15 grams of gelatin. You can go to the store and buy a packet of gelatin. You can make big non-alcoholic Jell-O shots for your athletes. But the premise is that they have to eat it before they are contracting their muscles. So about 30 minutes, maybe an hour before a rehab session. What happens is that muscle contraction then helps push the nutrient into the joint so it actually can get into the connective tissue. If you wait till afterwards, or if you don't do it in conjunction with the muscle contraction, it's not really doing you any good because there's so little blood flow. So if you have athletes where you are concerned about ligament healing, this can be a good strategy. I mean, his data is continuing to mount. Case studies are continuing to mount in this area. So hopefully next year we'll have some more clinical data to show you on this one. Bone is the next tissue, and I don't have much to say about bone because we'd like to think we could influence bone a little bit more nutritionally, but there's a stress fracture or break, there's really nothing we can do except make sure the athlete is getting the RDA for calcium and vitamin D. There is no need to go above. Your body will not handle the calcium any differently. There's no evidence to suggest more calcium is going to help a bone heal faster. Make sure they're getting the RDA, which is 1,000 milligrams per day for adults. Try not to take it all at once. Your body will handle it better if you could take, if you're giving them a supplement, don't give them 1,000 milligram supplement because the way your body absorbs, I won't get into calcium absorption, but your body doesn't absorb it as efficiently. So get the RDA and break it up throughout the day for bone. Okay, this is not a tissue, but it affects probably all the tissues in your body, and I want to talk a little bit about inflammation. So you're injured, you obviously have an inflammatory response. The problem is we don't understand very well kind of the cutoff, right? Acute inflammation we know is a good part of the healing process. Chronic high levels of inflammation over time are not so good and can then impair coming back to play. And so we have to kind of make some guesses and balance where we want to let the inflammatory response do its thing and where we want to start intervening. So this is kind of a quote directly out of Kevin Tipton out of University of Stirling, has written a really nice review paper on this. And so he claims that if you have a healthy athlete, they get injured, more than likely they are not going to have uncontrolled inflammation. Now, you know your athletes, right? And so that is something that you, and working with an RD, you have to kind of figure that out on your own. But in most cases, if they're otherwise healthy, they're not going to have uncontrolled inflammation. So you have to kind of use your judgment there. And that's where I'm going to kick it over to Jen again to talk about how you address kind of the use of antioxidants and anti-inflammatory foods. And actually, let me go forward one more slide, because in some cases where we do think the athlete maybe isn't eating enough antioxidant foods in their diet, colorful fruits and vegetables, tart cherry juice is probably the supplement. I guess it's not really a supplement, it's a juice, right? Where there's the most research, and here's how it's suggested to be used, the amount that you would need during the day. But I think Jen will have some good information. I wouldn't jump to tart cherry juice necessarily. You know, there's a lot you can do in the athlete's diet before that. So Jen, I'll let you address the inflammation piece.
Sure. And so as Kim said, we don't want to overdo the anti-inflammatory diet. We don't want to over supplement with anti-inflammatory nutrients because we need a little bit of that running. So from a dietary perspective, really what we want to assess is what's the baseline intake look like? You know, when that athlete sits down to a plate, is it all white? Or is it nice and colorful? And does it have a lot of fruits and vegetables? Are they eating from every food group? And that's sort of a general, really broad way to kind of look at it, is looking at the color. Most of the antioxidants in our food supply are going to come from our fruits and vegetables, and the ones that are deep, dark in color, really bright, really colorful. And so if our athletes are really eating whites and browns and yellows a lot and don't have a lot of color, this is a place where we can try and encourage them to broaden the scope a little bit, bring in some of these other foods that will help them meet some of the very baseline levels of antioxidants and these anti-inflammatory properties that the foods will bring. So we think about blueberries, we think about cherries, we think about red peppers. You just think of all the different colored foods. And that's really kind of a top-down global message that we can pass on, is the colorful plate that they put together, is how they build that plate at the table around mealtime, pre and post workout. The tart cherry juice is, as Kim said, that's a product that we can reach off the shelf and drink. And in the past, the way that I've used it is exactly this, which is 2 times a day, and we've encouraged our athletes to have one in the morning, particularly if they're working out in the morning, post-workout, and then after a rehab session in the afternoon, they'll grab one off the shelf as well. And so those are quick and easy ways to kind of pull those nutrients in.
Okay. So, of course, all these nutrients need to be in balance, in total calorie balance. And this can be an issue because a lot of times athletes think, oh, I'm injured, my activity level's going down, I don't want to gain weight, I'm going to cut my calories. But the problem is, when an athlete's injured, their resting energy expenditure may actually increase a little bit. And if they're doing things like crutching's hard work, right? That's going to increase energy expenditure a bit, especially if it's a college student getting around campus. So it's really important that we try to balance the energy needs of healing with the reduced energy needs of not training and competing like they were. And it's a fine balance, right? And unfortunately, we don't have like this prediction equation where I can say, okay, your athlete is injured, enter their body weight here, and that will tell you their calories, right? We don't have that. So it's a fine balance of figuring out where they need to be. Jen, how does an athlete know if they're eating enough or not enough?
That's like a magic question, right? It's really central, too, to this issue because, as you mentioned earlier in the beginning, if we're under-consuming calories too much, then that's at the cost of our muscle loss and muscle tissue loss. So we really want to keep an eye on this issue. So there's really 3 ways I'll share with you. One is, and very simply, is to check body weights. Okay, so if this is a great time to spot check body weights, and if an athlete is losing body weight on the scale, they're in negative calorie balance. So they're not eating enough to maintain their current activity or current expenditures the way that they are. And so that's a super easy way to do that. You all have access to scales. That's easy. Another way, so on the farther end, would be to kind of look at doing an RMR. So resting metabolic rate can help you if you have a way to measure that. Maybe you're partnering with an academic institution or you have access to that machinery. If you can gather that, you can then extrapolate and calculate out what their energy needs are in that state, and then plan an intake accordingly. That is a little bit more on the Cadillac version of the assessment, and probably best done in tandem with the dietitian. The other way, sort of in the middle, would be if you don't have access to a dietitian, you want to do something more than a scale, would be to spot check the athlete's intake. See what are they, do a scale weight, check their intake, and try to figure out, are they meeting their calorie needs? And there's a great link to a program that Kim was a creator of, Data, I believe is the name, right? On the GSSI website, that you can go in and input your foods and try and figure out how many calories is this athlete taking in from their food recall. And that's a great way to assess what their intake is versus what they need. And there's some quick resources also on the website to do what they need. So you can calculate out what they need, use the program to see what they're taking in, and see if there's a deficit there. Okay, but the scale weight too will do it.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, to wrap this up, let me leave you with a couple of resources. One is there's a website called mysportscience.com, led by a scientist named Oscar Eukendrup, and this is an example of an infographic he has on here that's a summary of some of the things that we've been talking about today. These are nice kind of things to hang up in your office to remind you what we were talking about. And then the other one is on our website on gssiweb.org. There is a sports science exchange article written by Kevin Tipton, who I mentioned earlier, that is a really nice summary of all the things we talked about today with the references if any of you want to dig in more. So I'll leave you with those two references. To finalize, tell me how many of you have access to a sports dietitian to work with regularly? One. Okay. So for the rest of you, Jen, I think we should end with what tips or advice do you have for these guys to start to incorporate some of this when they don't necessarily have a nutrition professional in their pocket to help them out?
Yeah, that's, and that's a challenge, right? Because you've got enough on your plate, and how do you know this issue is important, but what do you do? And I think some simple messaging that comes from you guys can go a long way. And so if we kind of rewind, the food patterning. This is really just education from you to your athlete that you can impart and encourage, and really that food patterning is super important. So regular meals throughout the day, checking those weights, spot checking the weights, encouraging them not to lose weight during this period is important, and then talking to them about what they're eating, and really educating them and encouraging them to focus on the quality of their intake during this time. Getting in those colorful plates, bringing in some color, try some fruits and vegetables, possibly encourage them to look for purchasing, whether it be some tart cherry juice or some of these foods to incorporate into their meals. Also, you can really bat home the idea that post-rehab, they should have a recovery snack. And you can really help remind them that when you're finished with them, that's the next step as they walk out the door. Okay? So those are just some take-home messages that you can really relay to your athletes in the absence of a dietitian. I will also say that if you are interested in getting hooked up with a dietitian that can work with you, you can go onto the SCAN, which is the Academy's Sports Nutrition Practice Group, and the website scandpg.org. There's right on the front page is a find a dietitian, and so you can type in your zip code and find a dietitian within whatever radius you choose there. So if that's something you might be interested in, that's an option as well.
Thanks, Jen. So I thank you for your attention. I think we went a little long. You can tell we get excited about talking about this. We're happy to take a question if anyone has it, or we'll be off to the side if people have questions as well.
Yep.